All right, let's jump into another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling a pretty big topic, the Great Commission, that instruction from Jesus to go and spread the good news.
Yeah.
And we're going to be using excerpts from a Bible study lesson kind of as our guide as we go, and really try to unpack the historical roots of this idea because, trust me, it's a lot more complex than you might think at first.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
I think a lot of times people oversimplify it and kind of come up with just a very surface level understanding.
Right.
But there are so many layers to peel back here and to really understand it. We need to go all the way back to the beginning.
Okay.
Back to the Old Testament even, to the Abrahamic covenant.
When I think about the Abrahamic covenant, I remember it being about, blessings for all the families of the earth.
Yeah.
But how does that connect to this idea of spreading the gospel? I mean, it seems like kind of a jump, don't you think?
I wouldn't say it's a jump. I would say it's really the foundation. So you're right. That covenant, that promise that God made to Abraham wasn't just about his descendants inheriting a certain piece of land.
Right.
It was about them being a blessing to everyone. It was about, that ripple effect that was going to start with Abraham and then spread outward.
So like a chain reaction almost.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And the idea of sharing God's blessing with others, of being a light to the nations. That's really where we see the seeds of the Great Commission being planted.
Okay, so the Israelites, as Abraham's descendants, had this responsibility to share God's blessings.
Right.
But then in the New Testament, we get to Jesus and he gives the Great Commission. Was this like a change in direction or?
I wouldn't say it's a change so much as a refinement. I think, the Israelites, for various reasons, didn't fully live up to that call that was on their lives. So when Jesus comes along, he takes that concept of blessing the nations and he focuses it laser sharp on his followers and he sends them out with a very specific message. So it's like taking that spark, that initial spark from the Abrahamic covenant and then igniting it into this global mission.
Oh, I like that analogy. So in the Great Commission, Jesus talks about going to all nations.
Right.
But that word nation, that seems a little tricky to me because today when we think of nation, we think of a country, with borders and a government and all of that. Was that the same understanding back then?
It's a great question. And that's a key point to understand, I think, in the Bible, that word nation is often referring to people groups. It's referring to tribes, clans.
Yeah.
It's not so much about a geographically defined area.
So it's more about the people.
It's about the people.
It's in that place.
Exactly. It's about reaching different communities of people no matter where they happen to be.
Even like migratory people groups.
Yeah, it could absolutely apply to that as well. And it's interesting, if you look up the word nation in like the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it actually acknowledges both of those interpretations. It talks about a politically organized body of people under a single government, but it also talks about a community of people composed of one or more nationalities and possessing a more or less defined territory. So even our modern dictionary recognizes that there's this broader, more fluid understanding of what a nation can be.
So even though the dictionary acknowledges both, I think it's safe to say that in the biblical context, we're leaning more towards that understanding of people groups.
Yeah.
And this really changes how we view fulfilling the Great Commission, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
It's not about, going and planting a church in every country on a map.
Right.
It's about sharing the gospel with every distinct group of people.
Which is a much bigger task.
Yeah, that's a much broader and more complex task.
Okay, so we've kind of got this historical background now.
Right.
Let's dive into the actual text of the Great Commission itself. It's in Matthew chapter 28, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, Matthew chapter 28.
What exactly does Jesus say there?
So in that passage, he tells his disciples to go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them to obey everything that he has commanded them.
Okay.
And it's interesting because he doesn't explicitly use the term church planting in that passage.
Right.
But all of those activities that he describes, the making disciples, the baptizing, the teaching, those are essentially the building blocks of establishing and growing a church.
So it's not just about proclaiming the gospel. It's
Right.
about building communities of faith.
Yes.
Of making disciples who will then continue this mission.
Precisely. The Great Commission has this element of multiplication built into it.
Yeah.
It's like a one-time event.
It keeps going.
It's an ongoing process of disciples making disciples
Yeah.
and extending that ripple effect, of God's blessing throughout the world.
I also find it fascinating that little detail in Matthew 28 about the name being singular. When referring to the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Right.
It's almost like foreshadowing the concept of the Trinity, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly hints at that, even if the full theological understanding of the Trinity came later,
Right.
it definitely points to that complex nature of God
Yeah.
and that interconnectedness of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
Okay, so we've laid out the historical background, we've dug into some of the language of the Great Commission itself.
Right.
But what does this all mean for us today? How do we, as modern-day Christians, apply these principles in a world that looks so different than the one that Jesus was speaking into?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think to really answer that, we need to take an even deeper dive.
Okay.
And we need to look at the challenges and the opportunities that we face, in a globalized, technologically driven world.
Yeah, that sounds like a great place to pick up in part 2.
Absolutely.
So join us next time as we continue to explore the Great Commission and its relevance for the 21st century Christian.
I'll be here.
All right, we'll see you then. Yeah, it really does feel like we're standing at this, crossroads,
No.
Between this ancient history and the modern world. And on the one hand, we have this instruction from Jesus,
Right.
rooted in this, ancient covenant, calling us to reach all nations with this gospel message.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we actually do that in the 21st century? I mean, the world looks a lot different now than it did, back in those times.
Oh, absolutely. I think the methods and the challenges of fulfilling the Great Commission,
Right.
they've definitely evolved. One thing that comes to mind immediately is technology.
Oh, yeah.
Technology has completely reshaped how we connect with people and how we communicate.
Yeah. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
It is.
Because on the one hand, we have all these incredible tools now for reaching people across geographical boundaries.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about, online platforms, social media, the ability to translate information,
Yeah.
instantly share things instantly.
It's unprecedented.
Yeah.
I mean, we can connect with people from all over the world.
Right.
From different cultures, different backgrounds in ways that, people couldn't have even imagined just a few decades ago.
Yeah.
So it's a huge opportunity for spreading the gospel.
But then there's the other side of that coin,
Right.
with all of this information overload,
Hmm.
the constant barrage of, digital noise. It's hard to cut through and actually have genuine conversations about faith.
Yeah, the digital age presents some unique challenges for sure. I mean,
Right.
how do you share the gospel authentically in a space that's often characterized by, fleeting attention spans
Right.
and superficial interactions?
It's all about the likes and the shares.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
it's like, is that really making an impact?
Right. Are we really connecting with people on a heart level?
Right.
Or are we just kind of, throwing things out into the void?
Yeah, so it seems like the key here is to find that balance.
Yeah.
We have to leverage technology's power for connection,
Mm-hmm.
but also be mindful of its limitations.
Mm-hmm.
We can't just, rely on posting a Bible verse on social media and
Right.
calling it a day.
It's not enough.
Yeah, fulfilling the Great Commission in the digital age, it requires intentionality, it requires creativity,
Yes.
it requires really understanding how to navigate that online landscape.
It does.
Yeah.
And it's about building genuine relationships online.
Right.
Engaging in respectful dialogue
Right.
and finding ways to make the gospel relevant to people's, digital lives.
I mean, it's like we need to become digital missionaries,
Mm-hmm.
learning the language,
Yes.
the customs of the online world in order to effectively share that message.
I love that analogy. I think that's a great way to put it. And just as missionaries throughout history have had to adapt to different cultures, different languages,
Right.
we need to adapt to this new digital frontier.
Yeah. And this whole conversation makes me think back to what we were talking about earlier with nations as people groups.
Right.
It's not just about geography anymore, is it?
No, it's not.
I mean, with globalization, with the internet,
These lines are so blurred.
they are. And we can't limit our understanding of reaching nations to simply planting churches, in different countries.
Right.
The Great Commission calls us to engage with people from diverse backgrounds, different cultures, and increasingly, even these online communities that we're a part of.
Yeah, like online communities that almost transcend national boundaries.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the mission field really is global and increasingly digital.
That's right. It is.
I mean, that's a huge paradigm shift, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, it really challenges our traditional notions of missions and forces us to rethink how we approach this whole thing.
Right. I think it requires us to be flexible,
Yeah.
adaptable, willing to step outside of our comfort zones.
And technology isn't the only challenge, is it? I mean, globalization has brought about, immense cultural diversity and often a clash of worldviews.
It's true.
So how do we navigate that complexity when it comes to sharing the gospel?
Yeah, that's where cultural sensitivity comes in.
And a deep respect for other people's perspectives.
Hmm.
We need to approach people from different backgrounds with humility,
Right.
recognizing that our way of understanding faith
It's not the only way.
is not the only way.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the right way or the best way. It's just our way.
So it's not about imposing our beliefs on others.
Right.
It's about building bridges of understanding.
Yes.
And finding that common ground.
Exactly. And it's about presenting the gospel in a way that resonates with people's cultural context
Okay.
without compromising,
Yeah.
the core message of the gospel.
Right.
It's about demonstrating the love of Christ through our actions, through our attitudes, even when we're faced with, differing viewpoints.
It seems like genuine listening is crucial here.
Oh, absolutely.
Really taking the time to understand where someone is coming from,
Yeah.
their background, their beliefs, before we even try to share our own.
I couldn't agree more. I think that's so important. We can't expect to share the gospel effectively if we haven't taken the time to understand the people that we're trying to reach,
Right.
you know?
Yeah, it makes me think about the Apostle Paul,
Mm-hmm.
who was so effective at adapting his message to different audiences.
Yeah.
He spoke to Jews and Gentiles. He spoke to philosophers and, everyday people. He always seemed to find a way to connect with their specific cultural context.
He's a great example of someone who understood the importance of contextualization in fulfilling the Great Commission.
This is all starting to feel incredibly complex.
Yeah.
We've got technology, we've got globalization, we've got cultural diversity. It's like the mission field has expanded exponentially.
Mm-hmm.
Does this even mean that the Great Commission is achievable in today's world?
That's a good question.
It feels almost overwhelming.
Yeah, it's definitely a daunting task, and it would be easy to get discouraged,
Yeah.
by the sheer scale of it all. But I think it's important to remember that we're not alone in this.
Okay.
The Great Commission isn't something that we're supposed to accomplish on our own.
Right. It's not like we each have our own little list of people to go and convert.
Exactly. It's a collective effort. It's a mission that involves the entire body of Christ.
Yeah, and that's where the power of the church comes in, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, we have this global community of believers, each with their own unique gifts and talents.
Yes.
And we're all working together
That's right.
to advance the kingdom of God.
Mhm.
That's encouraging to think about, but, even within the church,
Yeah.
there are so many different denominations, theological perspectives. How do we navigate those differences while still working together towards this common goal of fulfilling the Great Commission?
That's a great question. And it's one that Christians have been grappling with for centuries,
Right.
But I think the key lies in finding unity amidst diversity.
What does that look like in practice? Well, it starts with recognizing that even though we may have different interpretations, on certain theological points, we are united by our core belief in Jesus Christ
Right.
and his message of salvation. So we can agree on the essentials, the foundational truths of the gospel,
Right.
while allowing for diversity in how we express and live out our faith.
So it's about focusing on what unites us
Yes.
rather than what divides us.
Exactly. And that unity doesn't mean that we have to ignore our differences or pretend they don't exist.
Right.
It's about engaging in respectful dialogue, learning from each other, and finding ways to work together despite our differences.
And I can see how that approach would be crucial in a globalized world.
Absolutely.
Where we need to be able to collaborate with Christians from different cultures, different backgrounds, and recognizing that their experiences, their perspectives, might actually enrich our own understanding of the gospel.
Yeah.
It absolutely can. And that kind of cross-cultural collaboration can lead to incredible innovation and creativity in how we approach fulfilling the Great Commission.
This brings us to another crucial aspect of the Great Commission,
Oh.
the why.
Mm-hmm.
We've talked about the what, we've talked about the how,
Right.
but why is this mission so important? Why should it matter to us today in the 21st century?
That's a great question. And it's a question that really gets to the very heart of the Christian faith, at its core. I think the Great Commission is an act of love.
Right.
It's about sharing the good news of salvation with others because we believe that it's the most important truth in the world.
So it's not about forcing our beliefs on others.
No.
It's about extending that hand of love and offering them the same hope and the same transformation that we've experienced.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the inherent value and worth of every human being, regardless of their background, regardless of their beliefs, regardless of their location.
Yeah.
It's about seeing them as God sees them,
Yeah.
as beloved children who are worthy of love and grace.
It's like we're carrying this message of hope into a world that's often filled with darkness and despair.
That's a good way to put it.
And that hope isn't just some abstract concept. It's a real tangible force
Yeah.
that has the power to change lives.
Absolutely. And when people encounter the love of Christ, it can bring healing, forgiveness, purpose,
Yeah.
a sense of belonging that they may have never experienced before.
So fulfilling the Great Commission isn't just about like checking off a box
Right.
on our to-do list as Christians.
Oh, so much more than that.
It's about participating in something so much larger than ourselves.
Yes.
Something that has the potential to transform individuals and communities all around the world.
That's right. It's about being a part of God's redemptive plan for humanity. A plan that, we talked about earlier began with the Abrahamic covenant and continues to unfold today. And it's about recognizing that we're all called to be ambassadors for Christ, sharing his love and grace with a world that desperately needs it.
Yeah, it's amazing to think about that ripple effect. That one act of sharing the gospel can have this like transformative impact that goes way beyond us,
Right.
Reaches families, communities, even entire nations.
Yeah, it really is like throwing a pebble into a pond and watching the waves spread outward.
Yeah. Right.
We may never fully grasp the extent of the impact that our actions have on the world, but we can trust that God is working through us,
Right.
even in the smallest of gestures.
This brings us back to something we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
That idea of nations as people groups in a globalized world. How can we make sure that we're reaching all of those diverse communities with the gospel?
Yeah.
Is it even possible to reach every single people group?
That's a really challenging question, and it's one that missiologists and theologians, they're constantly wrestling with this. I think traditionally missions has focused on, sending missionaries to geographically distinct locations.
Okay.
But with the rise of globalization and migration, people groups are no longer confined to specific regions.
Right. We have like diaspora communities all over the world.
Exactly.
People who have migrated from their homelands, but they still maintain their cultural and linguistic identities.
Right.
So how do we reach those groups?
Yeah, it requires a real shift in thinking. We can't just rely on these traditional models of missions anymore.
Right.
We have to be adaptable. We have to be creative.
Right.
And find ways to connect with people groups wherever they are.
Wherever they are.
Whether that's in urban centers, online communities, even within our own neighborhoods.
Yeah. Right here at home.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's about being aware of the diversity that's around us, being intentional about building relationships with people from different backgrounds, and finding ways to share the gospel in a way that resonates with their cultural context. Absolutely.
And that's where I think collaboration becomes so important.
Yes.
We need to partner with churches and ministries that are already working with specific people groups, learning from their expertise and supporting their efforts.
That's a great point.
Yeah, it sounds like fulfilling the Great Commission in the 21st century, it really requires a global perspective.
It does.
We can't just focus on our own little local contexts.
Right.
We have to be aware of the needs and the challenges of the global church and find ways to contribute to that mission.
Absolutely. We're all part of this global body of believers, and we have a responsibility to support and encourage each other, as we work towards this common goal of making disciples of all nations.
This whole conversation has really challenged my understanding of the Great Commission.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's not just about going overseas and preaching to people who haven't heard the gospel.
Right.
It's about recognizing that the mission field is right here.
It is.
In our own backyards, in our workplaces, in our schools, in our online communities.
That's a crucial insight I think a lot of people miss, that, they think that the Great Commission is limited to some far-off exotic location.
Right.
But it's not. It's a call to action that permeates every aspect of our lives.
So how do we move from theory to practice then? How do we take all of these, complex ideas about globalization and technology and cultural sensitivity and actually apply them to our daily lives?
Yeah, it starts with a willingness to step outside of our comfort zones. We need to be open to building relationships with people who are different from us, people who may hold different beliefs, who come from different backgrounds.
And those relationships can't just be superficial.
No, they can't.
We need to be willing to engage in genuine dialogue, to listen with empathy, to build trust over time.
Exactly. It's about seeing people as individuals,
Right.
not as projects or statistics.
Mm.
It's about valuing their perspectives, even if we don't agree with them.
And when the opportunity arises,
Yeah.
we can share our own faith journey,
Mhm.
not in a pushy, preachy kind of way, but
Mhm.
in a way that invites conversation and genuine connection.
I love that. And it's about letting our lives be a testament to the transformative power of the gospel,
Right.
demonstrating the love of Christ through our actions and our words.
This all sounds great in theory, but I think a lot of people struggle with the fear of rejection
Yeah.
or the feeling that they're not equipped to share their faith effectively.
Hmm.
What advice would you give to someone who's feeling hesitant or unsure about how to even take that first step?
Well, first, I would say it's okay to feel hesitant. It's okay to feel unsure.
Yeah.
Sharing our faith can be intimidating, especially in a world where religious beliefs are often seen as, private or personal.
Right. It's like we've been conditioned to avoid talking about religion or politics in polite company.
Exactly. And so the gospel is too important to keep bottled up inside, Okay.
It's a message of hope and salvation that we are called to share with the world.
So how do we overcome that fear then?
Well, I think it starts with prayer.
Yeah.
Ask God give you the courage and the words to share your faith.
Mm-hmm.
He will equip you. He will guide you. And I think it's also about finding support within our church communities.
It's okay.
We don't have to do this alone. We can learn from others who have experience in sharing their faith.
Yeah.
We can practice with each other. We can encourage each other along the way.
That's a good point. We need to create a culture within our churches where people feel safe to ask questions,
Yes.
to express their doubts,
Mhm.
and to learn how to share their faith in a way that's authentic and relevant to their lives.
I love that it's about equipping each other to be ambassadors for Christ.
Right.
Not just in far-off mission fields, but in our everyday lives.
Exactly. The Great Commission is a call to action for all believers.
It is.
Regardless of our background, our personality, our level of theological expertise,
Right.
we can all play a part in sharing the good news of Jesus Christ with the world.
That's right.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the Great Commission,
Yeah.
I'm left with a sense of both the immense challenge and the incredible opportunity that lies before us.
Yeah.
It's a challenge that requires us to be thoughtful, intentional, and courageous, in how we approach sharing our faith in this complex and ever-changing world.
Absolutely.
But it's also an opportunity to participate in something truly extraordinary. We have
Right.
the privilege of being a part of God's redemptive plan for humanity, a plan that has the power to transform lives and bring hope to a hurting world.
And while we may not see the full impact of our efforts, this side of eternity,
Yeah.
we can trust that God is working through us, multiplying our efforts and using even the smallest acts of faithfulness to advance his kingdom.
And as we leave our listeners to ponder all of this, do
Yeah.
you have any final thoughts for them to consider?
Yeah, I would just encourage them to think about how their unique skills and talents and passions, how those things can be used to reach people, groups that have yet to hear the gospel. What innovative approaches could they explore to connect with people in a way that resonates with their cultural context?
That's a great question for them to reflect on.
I think so.
Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.
My pleasure.
We encourage you to continue exploring this fascinating and vital aspect of the Christian faith.
Yes. Keep seeking knowledge. Keep asking questions and keep diving deep.
All right, until next time.